Hello to everybody. My name is Shashi Jayakumar. I am the head of the Center of Excellence for National Security, CENS, at the Ratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University. I will be moderating today's session. Our speaker today will be familiar to many of you, not just on account of his accomplishments, but also for many of you who have been part of his lectures over the past week. Adam Garfinkle is on a year-long engagement at RSIS as a distinguished visiting fellow. He has, as I mentioned, a distinguished CV. He was the founding editor of the American Interest. He was also the editor of the National Interest, principal speechwriter to the US Secretary of State, while attached to the policy planning staff of the State Department. He is taught at several institutions of higher learning, higher education, including SAIS, Johns Hopkins. Adam is going to speak to us today on the title, Never Waste a Crisis, Reform Opportunities in the Post-COVID Era. But before I hand over to Adam, I would just like to make clear to you, and I think you know this already, that you will be able to post questions in YouTube's chat box. This will be a moderated chat. And after that, I hope to take the most interesting of your questions back to Adam. So without further ado, Adam, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Shashi. Glad to be back for the third of these three lectures. That three lectures can hardly exhaust really what's at stake and what is going on with the COVID-19 crisis that we're all facing and living through. But one does the best one can with what one has. I'd just like to mention before I actually get into the subject that while the title is How Not to Waste a Crisis, I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to talk first about, how I understand what the crisis is and how best we might understand what its implications are. And then I'll try to get down to the details of what obstacles stand between us and not wasting the opportunity that every crisis provides. I'd hoped in doing this that I'd be able to say something truly fascinating, new, and novel. But as I made my way through the material, I got the sense that maybe a lot of what I'm about to say is pretty obvious and not that exciting. I guess that depends on how much people in the audience have given thought to this. So we'll just see how it goes. So let me start by noting that history, philosophy, and literature teach us that pretty much any major crisis, certainly a globe-spanning pandemic disease, but not just globe-spanning pandemic diseases, tends to bring out both the best and the worst in people. And that goes for individuals, groups, whole nations, and even humanity itself, depending on the aperture of one's perspective. And as it does, the manifest polarization of behaviors, some noble behavior, some truly heinous behavior, mostly mixed and in-between behavior, poses an ultimate question with a sharpness absent in normal times. And that question is, just who do we think we are as a species, anyway? Now, there's nothing new. This kind of thing has been going on for a very long time. The first recorded pandemic in history took place in Egypt about 3,550 BCE, so more than almost 5,500 years ago. But back in those days, when something like COVID-19 or a smallpox outbreak or any kind of pandemic disease would strike civilizations, it was usually considered in the mytho-theological tone of the day to be some kind of a test. Are we being punished for our sins? Are any of us worthy of redemption? Are we a partner with the Creator in our future, or are we fated to be marionettes at the end of godly strings? And it's interesting, but nowadays, 6,000 years later, it's still possible to construe these kinds of things as a test, except nowadays, the test is written by the oracles of what passes for authoritative modernity. So the question's rephrased, it goes something like this: is humanity really a vociferous, violent, and even genocidal species? Or are we capable of moral as well as material progress? Can we rise to what Lincoln once called our better angels? Or are we fated to experience one Lord of the Flies moment after another until, with the help of pathogens, but not necessarily because of pathogens, we manage finally to extirpate ourselves from the earth? Of course, we don't know the answer to these questions. We see what we can do with them as we go along. But of course, these kinds of questions have been debated for a very long time. Now, what's different about pre-modern times and our own circumstances is that science can help us understand many aspects of how human beings behave, as well as how viruses and pathogens behave. Natural and social science, when they're at their best, can tell us what is, and history, as a filtered interpretive form of empiricism, can at least a little sometimes tell us what was. But as David Hume famously observed a long time ago, science cannot tell us what ought to be. And it's very important to understand the distinction, because there are no empirical metrics for moral reasoning. And yet, every template for social and political life, every program for reform, every effort to try to not waste a crisis has to be expressed in terms of a template of moral reasoning. That is at the essence of politics. It always has been, and it always will. So really what we're interested in when we talk about COVID-19, the crisis and the response to it, we're not just interested in what is true in a medical or epidemiological sense. We are most concerned with what isn't true of our social and political arrangements, but we varyingly think ought to be true about them. And I stress the word varyingly. I mean, our institutions are imperfect, to be sure, and they've been subjected to an unexpected stress test over the past 2 or 3 months. And a lot of people have found our institutions to be particularly wanting, but not always in the same way. So the pandemic will pass, as all previous pandemics have passed. It's not an existential threat to humanity, but what will not pass so soon, most likely, is arguments amongst ourselves within countries and among them as to what's gone wrong with our institutions, who is responsible for what's gone wrong, how we should fix them, and who should have the authority to say how they should be fixed. Now, the problem here is that within national frameworks and within local frameworks, it might be possible to reach some consensus on values and interests so that people can agree on a way forward. That's not a given, to be sure. But when it comes to the so-called international community, that's a big problem, because we don't have a consensus across the entire globe that meshes our sense of value priorities or our senses of interest. There are disagreements, there are conflicts, and there is also, of course, selective cooperation when interests are perceived to intersect. So this is a very simple observation. It's true all the time, but it becomes very sharper, much clearer in a case like this, where the need to cooperate at certain levels seems to be more imperative than ever, but the difficulty of doing it becomes more frustrating than ever. And we see that today, certainly in the arguments between the American government and the Chinese government, many other governments. We just can't seem to figure out a way to work together to deal with the problems. Instead, people are accusing each other of all sorts of heinous crimes and God knows what. And we don't seem to be cooperating all that well on the transnational level, and we don't seem to be cooperating very well on a national level, certainly not in the United States so far. So, you could say, in retrospect, the COVID-19 crisis and the response to it could be seen in retrospect as a huge important hinge point where people have finally managed to overcome key obstacles in the path of building a better world. Or contrarily, it could be seen as an accelerant that dumped humanity into a new dark age, this time not just a European dark age, but a fully global dark age. Or it could be seen as a stimulus for disagreement over what exactly the crisis period did bequeath. And I think that's most likely. We don't know for sure. Of course, time will tell. But one thing I think we do know already is that what matters to us most about what's happening is that the way to find out how this is likely to lead isn't by studying just pathogens and by studying, economic effects. It's by studying how people are already reacting to the crisis. I think that will tell us more about what the future will bring in a fundamental economic and social sense than anything we could learn about economics in a narrow way or about the pathogen itself. So in a way, it's our reactions, human reactions, that form the mirror whose reflections show us the true nature of humanity under duress and where that nature will likely lead us over the next few years. Now, three aspects of these reactions, it seems to me, are most important. So let me just state what they are very quickly, and then I want to speak briefly to each one of these three three aspects. So the first one is this. It seems to me that people at all levels of society and throughout all societies, political leaders, intellectuals, businessmen, journalists, clergy, pretty much everybody, tend to see the problems posed by the pandemic in terms they already understand and aligned with ideological proclivities that they already embrace. And that's natural, because thinking anew or synoptically about a novel threat to the human order is not easy, and relatively few people will manage it. And certainly they will not manage it at first when disorientation and emotional extrusion beclouds our judgment. Second, the heightened emotionalism that naturally enshrouds many people at times like these, again, very, very natural, conduces to extremist thinking and to polarizing expectations of what the crisis will bring, sometimes expectations that are unhinged from reality. So some people now are wildly optimistic about what the pandemic will bring, while other people expect, essentially the end of the world. Now, of course, there are temperate souls in between who resist such extreme expectations, but oddly enough, at uncertain times like this, uncertain inflection points like where we are now, it's even possible to overdo temperance. For example, we know there's an argument out there that pandemics don't really change reality very much. They typically just accelerate trends that are already in existence. And that's true sometimes. For example, if you look at the Spanish flu epidemic of about 100 years ago, the argument that pandemics just accelerate things that are already going on, that seems to hold true for the Spanish flu. But if you look at the Black Death of the 14th century, that is a case that seems to illustrate precisely the reverse. That was the hinge point of massive change in European history and then ultimately in world history. It's just that the way those changes developed and the way changes develop from pandemic disease episodes almost never result from deliberate effort. More often, they emerge slowly and in roundabout fashion as demographic, technological, social, and economic changes combine to produce novel end states that no one could have anticipated in the flames of a crisis, let alone could have directed from the midst of a crisis. And the third thing, as already noted in brief, crises are molten times. They tend to call forth innovative ideas and invite new political constructions. They furnish both reasons and pretexts as well for people to defect from inherited or cherished concepts, beliefs, rules, and expectations. And as a consequence, what we in the United States lately call the Overton window moves much faster than it does in normal times. And all that means is that, what the Overton window means is that options once presumed to be beyond political possibility suddenly seem nearly inevitable, and heretofore normal ways of doing things can seem obsolete almost overnight. The demand for options grows in a crisis like this, and as nature abhors a vacuum, that's what Spinoza said, that demand will summon a supply of options. But the problem is that not all innovations are wise. In the heat of worry, people often do hasty and regrettable things. That's just as true for nations as it is in individual lives. Yelena Bonner, Andrei Sakharov's wife, once said, "Fear gives bad advice," and as usual, she was correct. So here's the problem. I mean, if you sum up these three aspects of the way people tend to think in the midst of a crisis, that they tend to be inured to grooved thinking the way they have always thought, that they tend to think very emotionally, and they tend to polarize expectations either extremely positive or extremely negative, and that it's a time of great fluidity. If you put all these things together, what you get, it seems to me, is that the problem with the options that we're likely to see proposed, and because of the huge demand for how to fix our institutions, is that they're going to be suboptimal a lot of the times, because they're going to be subjected to the inescapable tunnel vision and the emotional derangement that accompanies the demand for options and for change. So we see these three aspects of ongoing reactions to the crisis come together to form a single mirror. I mentioned the mirror before, and I'll mention one at the end of the talk. So now that I've sort of just laid out these three ways that we understand how people are reacting to the crisis, now let me talk a little bit more about all three. So again, groove thinking. People tend to think in grooves. the coronavirus doubles as a kind of a Rorschach test, right? People see in the ambiguity what they are accustomed to see or what they want to see. And this reminds us of several, different sort of cognitive psychological concepts. One, the evoked set, which I think I mentioned last week, or what we sometimes now call confirmation bias. People see what they want to see. It's a very secure way to think, but in a novel circumstance, it's not often a useful way to think. So, for example, in the academic realm, economists tend to see the whole thing in terms of economics, and political scientists tend to see it all in terms of political science. And IR neo-realists tend to think of it in terms of the neo-realism. And at less refined levels of human thinking, anti-Semites see the whole thing as a Jewish plot. In India, as you've read, some uneducated Muslims attack government health workers, thinking that what their real intent is on infecting the faithful. Meanwhile, there are Hindu nationalists who blame Muslims for spreading the virus by spurning social distancing. And so you have nervous and power-hungry authoritarian governments on at least 4 continents who are focused on the risks generated by their own illegitimacy, who, for example, have used the crisis as an opportunity to drive street protests off the streets. And in other cases where there aren't any street protests, like in Hungary, to use the coronavirus crisis to get rid of pesky opposition forces. Now, in the United States, my country, we obviously have seen some right-wing type activists who claimed well into the middle of March that there was no coronavirus crisis, that it was all just a hoax. It was just a common cold, that's all it was. And the whole thing was spun up by the fake liberal media, all right, to scare people into giving up their liberty and their privacy rights, and also, of course, to undermine President Trump's re-election prospects. But at the same time, some people on the other side of the political spectrum at the extreme branded the White House's initial, if belated, travel ban on incoming flights from China and later Europe, called them racist in inspiration. So, pet parochial proprietary concerns get preserved because they're sort of larded on top of the pandemic crisis, so that you have, for example, people who are obsessed with global warming, some of them have seen what's been going on now as demonstrations of what a climate change crisis could be like. The Davos man, as Samuel Huntington named the archetypal cheerleader for global turbo-capitalism, cares deeply that the crisis not unwind globalization. But populists and their supporters hope, on the contrary, that it does unwind globalization. And for partially related reasons of their own, so do Salafi Muslims, and so do atavistic religious fanatics pretty much everywhere. So what all this proves, is if it needs to be proven to you, is that ideology is a brain disease, especially when it's propelled by fear and shaped by bigotry and opportunities for self-dealing. Alas, a symptom of the disease, I'm talking about ideology now, not the coronavirus, is that when beliefs and reality collide, usually so much the worse for reality. Even worse, perhaps, ignorance tends to overwhelmingly, like conflation, to lead to conflation and rigid dogmatism, while knowledge tends to distinctions and healthy skepticism. And that's why ideological thinking appeals so strongly to the poorly educated and weak of mind, who are not necessarily the same people, because it affords an economical way to interpret an otherwise very complicated, daunting, complex situation. And probably worst of all, novel crises like the one that we're in tends to deepen and further derange pre-existing ideological thinking, because the craving for simple answers grows in rough proportion to the sprawling confusions that are naturally generated by the kind of crises that we are now experiencing. Charles Frankel, who was a writer some years ago, once wrote, and I think this is really a very profound insight that he had. He wrote that ideas should not be dismissed as out of hand, as so obviously simple-minded as to not to be taken seriously, because simple-mindedness is not a handicap in the competition of social ideas, close quote. And he might have added, especially not in a crisis. So what it means in a nutshell is that groove thinking going into a crisis tends to end with the grooves getting even deeper as the crisis goes on. So now second, let me say a word about optimists and pessimists. Ideology also tends to shape the polarization of optimism and pessimism in a crisis, and what kind of expectations different people have of crises. But it's admixed with temperament. some people just are by nature pessimistic. Yikes. Are by that's just in case you're not in Singapore, that is just a manifestation of a little Singapore sprinkle. That's all it is. Don't worry. Some people have, naturally pessimistic, and others just have a sunnier disposition. Again, Lincoln once said that people are about as happy as they make up their minds to be. And I think Abraham Lincoln was probably right. But what Lincoln failed to explain is that why some people make up their minds one way and other people make up their minds another way. He never got around to talking about that. So, the willingness to see a bright silver lining in every dark cloud, I admire people who do that. I find it a very admirable trait. Optimism can be a force multiplier, as a former boss of mine used to say. It can be a go-to effective action. But like all good things and all good traits, too many and too much of them don't necessarily avail. Let me now quote one of my favorite writers, Walter Lippmann, who once said, and I truly love this remark, he said, it is a disease of the soul to fall in love with impossible things. It's a kind of falling in love that acts as a drug and leads one astray. And that is what some people seem to have done in this crisis. So let me give you an example of one highly optimistic commentator. I'm not going to mention his name, but this is what he said. I'm quoting from something written not that long ago. The global COVID-19 pandemic will be seen in retrospect as, quote, the great accelerator that moved us from the continuity of the past to a new era. Only an event that uproots all preconceived notions, an epistemic break, has the power to alter the human condition. Only catastrophic plagues and wars have ever prompted societies in the past to fundamentally address social inequality. So you see what he really cares about. Continue the quote. That applies across the board to other challenges. In time, and by the sheer evolutionary instinct of our species, he says, now get this, geopolitics will inexorably adapt to the nature of microbes, not the other way around. Close quote. Now, there's only one thing wrong with this prediction, and that is that there is no historical basis for it whatsoever. How did geopolitics adapt constructively to the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918-1919? With World War II and the Holocaust? How did geopolitics adapt to the Black Death of the 14th century, or to Justinian's plague of the 6th century, or to the plague that struck Athens in 420 before the Common Era? So you have to be very careful here. I mean, yes, the scientific and medical communities were impelled to make major advances after the recent 20th century epidemic struck, and they're likely to do so again to great and benign effect. But the problem is that to see this kind of progress as necessarily, inexorably, as the quote had it, inexorably spilling over into politics, let alone global geopolitics, is completely unwarranted. Functional cooperation does not dictate political outcomes. Let me repeat that. Functional cooperation, no matter how robust, does not dictate political outcomes. And that is because politics is, for better or worse, an autonomous domain of human culture. And at base, there is a stunningly simple reason for this. As John Gray, British political thinker, puts it, science and technology are cumulative, whereas ethics and politics deal with recurring dilemmas. A truer statement about the nature of these matters, I don't think, has ever been stated. So politics is, of course, affected by, and it in turn affects developments in culture, economy, even the paths of applied science, but it doesn't march in lockstep with any of them. So what we're seeing so far is that even as functional cooperation among medical researchers is increasing and is getting, perhaps some very excellent results, what we're seeing is that global politics is responding to COVID-19 by backing away from globalization. So we are witnessing political social distancing on a global scale in parallel with physical social distancing on a local and a personal scale. They do not march lockstep. Now, it's all well and good to be optimistic and to hope that the so-called international community will pull together politically to confront COVID-19. And as I said, in below the radar, below the political radar ways, it's doing that. But above the political radar, I don't think that's very likely to happen. And understand that while local communities are sociological facts, the so-called international community is really just a metaphor. Its use usually accounts to little more than virtue signaling among devout liberal internationalists who have either forgotten or never learned that their transnational idealism, first of all, doesn't appeal to most normal people, even if most normal people can understand it. It doesn't have an autonomous basis in reality, separate from the power and reputation of the national states that promote those values, and that it has a history that includes such disastrous, lulling distractions as the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. Now let's talk about the pessimists. The pessimists are in some ways even more interesting and frustrating than the optimists. Pessimists are manifesting equally extreme views in the crisis, and they're equally liable to be mistaken. The habit of prophesying doom, said Raymond Aron, the great French thinker, testifies less to lucidity than to resignation. It also testifies to a strange desire on the part of some people to pull the whole tent down on everybody else out of spite or envy, or an illusory desire to live their life large, even in an apocalyptical cast of mind. People get dreamy and glassy-eyed sometimes when things like this happen. Outsized pessimism in the COVID-19 era, to me, bears an uncanny resemblance to the more extreme versions of global warming hysteria that have been on display now for years. So whatever else one might say about catastrophe, Armageddon, or garden variety unnamed end of the world scale mass destruction scenarios, they're neither small beer nor are they boring. There's something unmistakably irrational about off-the-charts pessimism. I mean, it smacks of Freud's notion of thanatos, the death wish, but on a collective scale. And at the same time, it's of a piece with some religious themes. Now, note, for example, the descriptions in the Christian Bible's book of Revelations, all right? And yet it's antithetical to a key function of religious communities over time. I would like to say more about the resemblance of pessimism in this crisis to religious thinking, but I just don't have time. But I just want to end this section by saying that much follows from adopting either and also from proselytizing either an outsized optimistic or pessimistic reading of the crisis. So, for example, most pessimists now think that populists will benefit from the crisis politically, because it will show that the populist opposition to the high priests of globalization had been proven correct. So the whole system collapsed like a house of cards, and those on the bottom of the pile got hurt disproportionately. And so they predict that Trump will get reelected in November, and that this will be the only really factor that'll really matter in November. The optimists, on the other hand, think populists will suffer politically, at least in countries with free and fair elections. Why? Because they've been manifestly incompetent in handling the virus, and they have. They were dead wrong in their blasé early underestimations of its danger. They were. And they've been irresponsible in their arrogant dismissal of scientific and medical expertise. So that means Trump will lose, of course. And it's the only factor that will matter in November. Now, as with many things about the crisis, as I say, time will tell. I expect a mixed result on this and most other divided predictions, all of which are going to blur together as the illness passes and reactions to it fade into the rest of our species' kaleidoscopic filtered reality. Whether Trump wins or loses in November, it almost certainly won't be the only thing. COVID-19 won't be the only thing that determines the outcome. So I'm not going to talk about emotionalism in molten times because I'm running out of times. Let me just get right to the very conclusion I want to reach. You know, in hyper-inflected emotional times like these, the most important thing that anybody can have on the international level or on the national level is sound, calm, empathetic, consistent, and competent leadership. And I think that's true for the world at large. So I think the November 2020 American election was always going to be very important, and not just for Americans, given America's role and its posture for the last 70 years. But now the importance of that election defies estimation. It clearly is the most important election for the world in the 20th and 21st centuries. And why is that? Because wise leaders matter a lot. Wise leaders in the most influential countries, who will influence leaders at all other levels, will understand that we do not need to demolish global economic institutions and go back to patterns that replicate the impoverishing nationalist autarky of the 1930s. But we do need to make these institutions more resilient. We need to better buffer them against the possibility of disruption, better than the jerry-rigged, capriciously constructed and accident-prone contraption that we have now. We need architects and builders, not wrecking crews. We need leaders who unify society, not who divide, provoke, mislead, distract, and fear harvest for narrow, parochial, and selfish purposes. We need leaders who seek out and promote social synergies, not leaders who are parasitic on national and local community. The big question in the American context, I think, is whether any of that can be done without confronting, if not deconstructing, the new malefactors of great wealth, to quote Theodore Roosevelt from his 1912 Bull Moose campaign. I'm talking about the global scale concentrations of private corporate wealth that loom over the same terrain as states, and that as often perforate their sovereign management capabilities as support them. We're going to need leaders who understand that we shouldn't destroy our international institutions, despite the fact that none of them have been worth very much during this crisis. We instead have to build them better. We have to recreate them on realistic premises instead of on self-preening, pious, and essentially magical wishful thinking. The crisis has shattered a lot of pretensions, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But now that those pretensions have been shattered, we need to do better than we have done in the past. We don't need to introduce draconian protocols or make government permanently larger, more intrusive, and less accountable. But in the United States, we do need to adjust the way we prepare, invest in capacity for and manage major public health emergencies. I'm almost done. We do not in the United States necessarily need to institute an expensive federal guaranteed national income scheme, but we do need to rethink how we can buffer major shocks in a way that's more effective and that other countries have done than what we have now. Look, every country will have its challenges. And I think the ones who find responsible leadership and who have the institutions that will allow that leadership to manifest in reforms, that those countries can expect after COVID-19, they can expect social revival, economic growth, and cultural renaissance. But I think those societies that don't find wise leadership will be in trouble. And some of them will possibly be in very big trouble. Now, finally, therefore, in the end, the outcomes that we care most about in the COVID-19 era will not eventuate mainly on what happens to the virus. It's not about the virus in the end, folks. It's about us. It's about us. So allow me, in conclusion, to phrase the matter after the fashion of a literary metaphor. Some of you know that I like literary metaphors. I want to specifically mention Charles Perrault's 1696 story, Le Bel à Bois dormant, a story brought to 20th century English-speaking audiences by Walt Disney. And I speak, of course, of the 1959 animated classic, Sleeping Beauty. So are you ready for this? Get ready for this. COVID mirror on the wall. What kind of species are we, after all? Thank you. Over to you, Shashi.
Thank you very much, Adam. That was a barnstorming finish to quite a deep dive into contemporary concerns. And even before that, I think really appreciated your dive into the historical panorama of past concerns in earlier ages as well. And I think we all gained quite a great deal from your talk, actually. I'm going to invite the audience to please key in your questions to the YouTube chat. But before that, if you don't mind, Adam, if I use my moderator's or chair's prerogative to maybe pose one or two things which I thought might be worth picking up on from your talk. There is one earlier part of your talk where you talked about the emotionalism or irrationalism, peoples and so on who are unhinged from reality as a result of this current pandemic. That's very interesting. I wonder whether you would care to elaborate on this. And my particular interest would be the extent to which this kind of rationalism or emotionalism can potentially seep into various political cultures, to the elite which governs us. And do you think there's a risk of this happening in certain theaters or indeed worldwide? Please.
I'm glad that you asked that. It gives me a chance to get back to some of the things I wasn't really able to cover. It's natural that people get emotional when they're scared. Sometimes fear pushes people into passivity, into almost a kind of an intellectual fetal position. They get glassy-eyed and they just, lock down. But other people respond to emotional pressure and stress by becoming angry. And anger can sometimes lead to violence. And so I think all of us are worried that if the virus passes into other parts of the world that haven't so far been affected so much, poorer parts of the world where more traditional and less Weberian forms of government exist, that social upheaval and violence and unrest could really cause a lot of trouble. And if you have a lot of violence and unrest in many countries, it could bring down regimes. It could make any government's effort to effectively handle the crisis hard to maintain. And of course, in a pandemic, nobody wins the end of the pandemic until everybody wins the end of the pandemic. So if you get huge spikes of infection in countries like that, it could double back around and reinfect countries that have passed through what they think are the more difficult times. So the nature of political cultures throughout the world differ. In many parts of the world, as you know, instead of having sort of modern, Weberian kinds of formal authority, there are still patrimonial societies that operate on, according to different rules and, different habits. So it's very important to understand, sort of the social and cultural substrata of different countries. In the United States, and we've seen in many parts of the world, we've seen sort of, I would call them pre-modern or pre-enlightenment religious groups be sources of irrational lava flows. And we've seen them in lots of places. So, for example, in the United States, everybody's seen this on television, I'm sure. You have, the Liberty Warriors, many of them evangelicals from the churches, who refuse to adhere to social distancing or lockdowns, who claim the government doesn't have a right to tell them to stay in their homes, that it's an affront to liberty, that it's a violation of the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and so on and so forth. And I mean, maybe you saw there was a woman in a car at a so-called Liberty rally in Michigan. Policeman told her, not to get close. She rolled down the window and she said, "I'm washed in the blood of Jesus, so you have nothing to say to me." So that's in the United States. In India, back in February, Rajputs held a Corona festival. 10,000 people gathered together in close quarters, but they believed that their high caste status, protected them against the virus. Well, they found out that it didn't. And then there were large tabligh gatherings in Pakistan and in Malaysia. So you see this all over the place. But it's deceptive. Let me just finish because historically, religious organizations and authority were not sources of irrationality. On the contrary, religious institutions and religious leaders assumed irrationality among people, and religious organizations and authority were designed to channel and limit irrationality. That's why in almost every religious tradition, there's a certain time of the year where it's possible, in fact, where it's encouraged to go out and break the rules. So in the Catholic tradition, we have Mardi Gras, we have Carnival. In the Jewish tradition, we have Purim. In some Hindu traditions, we have Holi, and so forth. So, but there are rules for how to break the rules. The idea is it's okay to let off steam sometimes, but there have to be rules for even how you do that. What happens when human flows of irrationality jump the tracks of religious authority and they get into the political world? Well, we've seen what happens when things like that go on. You get genocidal or quasi-genocidal violence in times of great unstuckness. We've seen it. We saw it the Holocaust. We've seen examples since then of mass murder that arising out of highly irrational movements. Winston Churchill once predicted that the wars of ideology would be worse than the wars of religion, and that's why. Because religious institutions had a way of controlling or channeling flows of irrationality. And now what we have in a political age is a kind of a merger of religious and political types of irrationality. You see this most vividly among Salafis in the Arab world, in the Muslim world. And when that sort of thing starts to happen, all bets are off. So, you worry about this kind of thing. I mean, in the United States, the last thing I'll say here, over the past couple of months, there's been a huge increase in gun sales, as if there weren't enough guns in the United States. People are going out and buying guns. This is not a cheerful thought. I mean, even in the United States, which is hardly a pre-modern country, the prospects of flows of irrationality, including violent irrationality, is something that can't be ruled out. So in other countries that are not at the same level of, Weberian, forms of government, I mean, Lord knows what can happen. And I think we have to understand religious cultures and other aspects of traditional cultures to really get a feel for what might happen.
Thanks very much, Adam, for the comprehensive reply. We have a question. The question is as follows. Does the wise leadership that you mentioned in your talk, does it demand an epistemological humility in general? I'll repeat that question. Does the wise leadership needed demand an epistemological humility in general? And I will hand over that question to you, and I'll encourage the audience members to continue to pose questions in the YouTube chat. Please, Adam.
Yeah, as I mentioned, there are an ensemble of virtues or qualities in leadership that I think are crucial at a time like this, and I think humility is one of them. It's not the only one, and I think the mix of reassurance and humility, it kind of depends on the political culture. Leaders need to talk to their people in ways that align with and resonate with, that society, that culture. There are some places, in Singapore, when Prime Minister Lee speaks, he can make reference to some fairly esoteric, technical, and technocratic methods. The people in Singapore understand that. They're used to that. They lived through SARS 2003. They've been through MERS, and they've been through Zika, and they've been through dengue. And people in East Asia, especially in Singapore, are used to this kind of thing, and they understand when a leader talks like that. If you tried to say stuff like that in Cambodia, say, or maybe in Malawi, it wouldn't work. So I think humility is an essential aspect of effective and wise leadership. But I think it varies from place to place, just what you'd emphasize and what you de-emphasize.
Adam, earlier in your talk, you've talked about the reactions of peoples to pandemic, irrationality, emotionalism, and so on. You've also talked about leadership, government. You also made allusions to institutions, global or world institutions. And I'm just wondering about these institutions, because depending on your point of view, and I can't claim to speak for everybody here, but depending, you could say the WHO's response has left a lot to be desired. You could argue its response has been politicized. And of course, what about the UN? What does the UN does as well? So would you be on the side of those to say that the role of key institutions has been undermined or seriously compromised? Or linking back to the earlier question about humility on the part of leaderships, do you think a truly humble leadership, which hopes to play this kind of world statesman role, should realize it needs the humility to try to build back up these world institutions?
I certainly agree with the last part of your question. Yeah, I think people ought to be far more deliberate and realistic about building international institutions than has typically been the case. These are really excellent questions. In general, when it comes to transnational or international institutions, there's a paradox. And the paradox is as follows. The more representative the institution tends to be, the wider its membership, the more inclusive its membership, the more difficult it is to get it to function effectively in a pinch, or to get it to function effectively at all. The smaller the institution, the less representative it is, right? The tighter it is, the easier it is to get it to function effectively to solve problems. So you've got this paradox. How do you square the paradox between having institutions be and feel representative and getting them to function? In a way, it's the difference between in the UN case between the General Assembly, which is universal and very, very representative, but of course it can't do anything, and the Security Council, which is far smaller and can sometimes get things done, but is not representative. And you have an orthogonal point with regard to the functional agencies of the UN. The international organizations that tend to be below the line of political sight, like the Universal Postal Union or the SWIFT system or the International Bank of Settlements. I mean, these organizations function very well. That's because nobody notices them politically, right? They're below the line of sight. As soon as you politicize one of these kinds of organizations, like UNESCO in the past or like the World Health Organization now, you make it much more difficult for them to function. So That's a very, very important point to raise. The more general institutional point, I think, is even more critical. Not so much on the international level, but on the national level and subnational level. One point that I wanted to make but didn't have time to was, look, every time there's a crisis, whether it's a pandemic crisis or whether it's a war crisis or some other kind of crisis, whether it's a tsunami, say, the crisis fits into the context of an existing institutional framework, whether that framework is effective, more or less, or whether it isn't. It's a little like thinking about, a bowl of a volume of water poured into a basin, right? The water will take the shape of whatever the basin is, right? So that's the way to think about how a crisis fits into an existing, human social organizational template. Now, in societies that have institutions that are working effectively right now, I would say Singapore's institutions work pretty well, at least the ones relevant to the situation right now. You tend to get a functional response, decent functional response. Institutions in the United States right now are a complete mess. They're not a mess because of COVID-19. They were a mess before COVID-19. COVID-19 just revealed the mess to people who weren't paying attention, okay? We've had institutional decay in the United States in various aspects of government for more than 30 years. The deterioration has been quite profound, more in some aspects than in others. And we see that now all lit up in lights because COVID-19 has revealed the shortfallings in our institutions. The same might be said, seems to me, for China. It seems to me the inability of both the Chinese government and the US government to shield emergency responses in a public health crisis from politicization has been the bane of both societies. The way the Chinese screwed up the initial response to the crisis has been devastating. And the way the United States has screwed up not just its initial response, but its ongoing response has been equally devastating. Both were the result of unnecessary politicization. In the United States, for example, we have pre-existing arrangements for war crises, let's say, called continuity of government, where people just do what they need to do, and it doesn't ever get politicized. The same thing is true for the Department of Homeland Security. If there is a huge earthquake or a huge storm, there are automatic protocols that snap into effect when things like this happen. It's not something that gets decided in the Oval Office. There's no reason why emergency health protocols in the United States or in China couldn't be designed in the same way to take these initial critical decisions out of the hands of amateurs and let people who know what they're doing take care of it. And that would free up political leadership to take a strategic view of how to respond to crises like this. So it's just institutional foul-ups really that explain this. And these are, in other words, the COVID-19, you can't do anything about the virus showing up really, I don't think. But the consequences that we've seen were not inevitable. They were evitable. They could have been prevented in large part. But the politicization of both the Chinese government and the US government, and of course other governments, and the institutional deficits that both have, those were the reasons why things have gone weird and gone bad. So you're absolutely right. Whoever asked the question is absolutely right. The institutional underpinning of all this is critical. And I think really, just to tie the knot on the question, countries that have problems institutionally, like the United States does right now, we really ought to fix our own problems before we go around trying to dictate to other countries how the international order ought to be repaired. We ought to get our own house cleaned up before we go, prancing around trying to fix all these international institutions.
Thanks for your comprehensive reply, Adam. In your reply, you touched on China. China also makes an appearance in your abstract. So I assume to some degree you're willing to be drawn on China. And in your abstract, you mentioned how current set of issues will particularly require the Chinese government to make a critical choice, end quote. Would you be prepared to elaborate, to some degree at least, as to what you think the futures are for China, the Chinese state and institutions?
I'm not an expert on China. So let me refer people to a recent essay in the American Interest by my longtime friend and colleague, with whom I sometimes disagree. That's just the way life goes. Frank Fukuyama, The last couple of days, I think just 3 or 4 days ago, where Frank put up a piece in the magazine called, what was it called? How to Understand the Chinese Regime, or Chinese, something like that. I can't remember the title right off. I think it's a very interesting, historically deep essay. And Frank has spent a lot more time reading and thinking about China than I have. One of the reasons I came to Singapore was so I could learn more. But Frank's characterization of Xi Jinping, China, different from Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao and Zheng Jiming, is that what we have here is a wannabe totalitarian state. Frank analogizes it to the Soviet Union in the 20s and the 1930s, an aspiring totalitarian state, not the market authoritarianism that we all thought China was when Deng Xiaoping directed the country out of the Maoist era. And I think that's correct. I think that's right. But I would point people to Frank's essay for more detail. Let me just say this, though. Sino-American relations right now are almost in free fall. They've worsened so quickly on so many levels, and the fault lies on, I think, on both sides, that it actually worries me quite a bit. Accidents happen. And right now, there's only negativity in the relationship coming from both sides. And that has a tendency to spiral on itself. So that if, God forbid, there was some accident, say at sea near Palawan Island, I'm just making this up, right? Things could take on a life of their own. Nobody in July 1914 expected peak in a couple of accidents and one assassination to lead to the First World War, but it did, right? When you set up dominoes a certain way, all negative, then it doesn't take a whole lot to light them off in a way that everybody regrets. So it really worries me. I actually worry about the Chinese government right now less than I worry about the American government. Just consider for a second, just two things that I'd like to point out. You remember, most people remember, I think, that toward the beginning of this rolling nightmare in the United States on this crisis, the president said, I think to the surprise of a lot of people, that the federal government had no responsibility for dealing with the crisis. And then about 3 days later, he did a 180 and said that the president has total control. All right. I don't know what kind of a mind thinks like that it can move from the first statement to the second statement in just 3 days. Now, that's a little bit worrying right away. But there was method in what seemed to be the madness of what the president was doing. So he knew that some of the things that Americans were going to have to put up with for the next couple of weeks, a crushing economy, a swooning economy, crashing markets, schools closed, lockdowns, social distance. These things were going to be very unpopular. Okay, so what did he do? He deflected the unpopularity off onto local government, off onto states and municipalities. He just deflected it off onto others. And then when the unpopularity emerged, all right, what did he do? He encouraged it. He tried to harvest the anger that he himself had directed against state and local government. Now, that is a very cynical way to handle a thing like that. But from a purely cold-blooded, Randian point of view, as a political tactic, it's downright genius. I mean, if you have no scruples, it's absolutely genius. So it's important. This is something that the Chinese government at first tried to blame the local authorities in Hubei province of Wuhan for all the screw-ups that they were part of. But none of this was surprising because this is still a Leninist one-party state. And the Leninist one-party state, just like it reminds me of Chernobyl during Soviet times. States like that can't tell themselves the truth. They never really know what's going on because it's a shoot the messenger kind of political culture. So the local authorities in Wuhan were terrified to find out that's why they shut up the doctors, right, and muzzled them. And they didn't tell people in Beijing until kind of late in the game. And then when the people in Beijing found out about it, they did the same kind of thing. I mean, they were trying to figure out a way to evade responsibility for what happened. So basically, the Chinese lost about a month, 2 weeks to a month. If they had not let 5 million people, travel for Lunar New Year out of Wuhan and Hubei province, probably 90% of what's going on in the world right now wouldn't be happening. But that's the way that Marxist one-party shoot the messenger kind of political cultures behaves. So they behave in one dysfunctional way, The American government right now, with Donald Trump as president, is behaving in a completely different dysfunctional way, but both ways are dysfunctional, and it's now shrouded the entire world with this problem. So,
thanks, Adam. Question: the metaphor of pouring water into a bowl, which is a metaphor you've used,
yeah.
implies an inflexible bowl.
Yeah.
Do you believe crisis preparedness can help to cultivate flexible organizations that can adapt and flex?
Yeah, you know, every metaphor limps. And,
yeah, there are a couple of questions.
Some metaphors fall down. Yeah, obviously the bowl can change shape. So, you know, something like this is going to affect institutional arrangements. It has to. With any luck at all, it will improve them. All right, at least in some respects. But like I say, you know, the crossover from being more effective in terms of preparing for public health emergencies, the crossover from that into politics is not a given. You know, in a dysfunctional, polarized political environment like in the United States right now, I would like to see, I would hope to see some positive spillover from functional coordination and improvement into the political sphere. But I don't know that it's going to happen. I mean, it would be nice if in November the current incumbent were not reelected. That would at least open a chance that could happen. But I wouldn't want, if I were a betting man, I wouldn't bet on it right now. I'm kind of pessimistic about that. But sure, you're absolutely right. You know, just because in the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, 1919, you didn't see a whole lot of flexibility and change in institutional arrangements, doesn't mean that it can't happen and that it hasn't happened in other circumstances. It has, and it likely will. But again, as I mentioned earlier on in my presentation, the environment right now predisposes people to be impatient, to be emotional, and to not necessarily be all that deliberate. As I said, I quoted Elena Bonner: "Fear gives bad advice." So another aspect of wise leadership is to know the difference between complacency and panic. Okay, you want to be deliberate about these things. What I mentioned last time when I talked about net assessment. You want to have a serious method in place to think about these things in a careful, deliberate, logical fashion. You don't want to blurt out one way or the other and then regret what you did. All right. You don't want to waste time making stupid mistakes when if you take a little bit more time, you can actually get this right. So it depends to some extent on the maturity of the institutional arrangements that are in place and the maturity of the leadership that knows how to operate those arrangements. Right. So, you know, every country has its own deal. In the West right now, there are here and there are several populist governments. And one of the things about a populist government is that it tends to disparage the role of government. Now, it's kind of how do you expect populists who think government is the problem? How are they supposed to operate a government to fix a problem like this when they think that government is the problem in the first place? It's an issue. You know.
Another question, Adam, has to do with disinformation and fake news. And the question is, shouldn't there be a supranational, authority that can dispel disinformation by governments and help moderate tensions and emotions?
Yeah, that would be great. How do you do that? I don't know how you do that. In the United States, I wrote a piece a couple of months ago, actually before the crisis, on deep fakes, which is a special category of disinformation. And my argument in that essay, which has not yet been published, my argument in that essay is that on a national level, law can, to a considerable degree, produce a deterrent to harmful disinformation, deep fakes, and other kinds of screwing around with reality. But on an international level, it's very difficult to imagine law being able to do that. It would be like customary international law, like the kind of law that protects diplomats, for example. You would have to find a lowest common denominator sort of zone where there would be enough overlap of interests to get anything done. At higher levels or more difficult levels, you have conflicting interests among powers. For example, the Russian government today, during the time of the Soviet Union, and going all the way back to the Black Hundreds of the Tsar, the Russian government weaponizes disinformation. It's been doing it for almost 150 years. To get the Russians to sign on to an international agreement saying, well, we're not going to do that anymore, I just don't see how you do that. So until you have a commonality among political cultures and all these major powers, I just don't see how that's going to happen. In fact, I see something quite different happening. You have now a hierarchy of capability, of technological capability developing in the world, where some countries, they don't have to be big countries. They could be small countries like Singapore or Israel or Finland, you know. You have some countries that have fairly advanced capabilities in information science and artificial intelligence, and who are capable of doing fakes and doing disinformation at a very sophisticated level. And then you have lots of other countries that are more likely to be prey or targets of those kinds of efforts. And I can see a situation, essentially, of re-importing a form of imperialism, where countries that are worried, leaderships that are worried about being attacked by disinformation, will go to other countries that are, that are good at this stuff and say, please help me, please protect me from these attacks that I worry about. And then, of course, the people who have these higher level capabilities will say, okay, well, we'll protect you from your adversaries who are trying to, hack your elections and mess with your information stuff. But what are you going to give us for protecting you? How much is it going to cost? You can see transactional, I wouldn't call them alliances, but you can see transactional relationships of protection, or you would call it insurance, really, developing in the international system in time, along this hierarchy of who is capable of doing these things and renting the service out to those who need it but can't produce it for themselves. I think that's much more likely than international agreements to control or ban disinformation. But Shashi, if you can think of a way to do it, man, I'm all ears. It would be great if we could do it.
That'll be a long time coming, I'm afraid. And on that happy or rather unhappy note, I'd like to thank Adam for your presentation, your time. I think I certainly, and all of us in the audience, have benefited from your deep wisdom and insights, not just over this lecture, but over your past two seminar talks as well, this being your final seminar talk. I'd like to thank everyone again for their presence. Hope to see you at the next RSIS session. Please look out for the publicity emails accordingly. And I believe, Adam, you've agreed to put the text of your remarks online at the RSIS website.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes, the text, an earlier version of the text was published for an Arabic-speaking audience a month ago. If you speak Arabic, you're in great shape. If you don't, I have an English language version that we will, as Shashi said, that we will put up. And I would just ask one favor, please. If anybody has constructive criticisms about how I can make the essay better, please don't be shy. Please let me know. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Adam, for coming in. I'd like to thank the audience again, and hope to see you at the next session.